Our day and age seems marred by a kind of collective dissolve that we all seem to sense in one way or another. There's a lack of innovation and newness in this age, and there's this reoccurring reconsumption, regurgitative quality to the past. There are no new religions, no new mediums, and everything just kind of seems to be stale. Overall, there isn't a hope for the future in the sense that there isn't a collective dream of the hopes that the future may bring. It seems that the future is only thought of as a continuously damning and torturous prospect. And there's no shortage of sectors to look at to substantiate this overall feeling, whether it's education or the media or healthcare, so on. And while many would point to economic factors or point to governmental factors, there is an undermentioned story here of our own morale, of our own psychology, of our own spiritual inclinations, let's just say. This age overall has given way to a kind of nihilism, and I just use that as a term of convenience. But it's not always been like this. There is a way to trace how we got here. There are several ways of tracing how we got here. And going through a rough history to understand how we got here helps us inform ourselves as to what we should do or what are remedies to this overall staleness, sickness, hopelessness that can become of us in this modern age. If you stick with me, then you'll see that we've overall lost the plot. We've lost the dream. And this isn't the first time that humanity has reached this kind of conjuncture. And so in that way, we can benefit from the past and we can benefit from the things left behind in order to better inform the future. We are all a part of a lineage, and so our generational traumas reverberate into our current day attitudes. This history can never be fully told without the stories of many different peoples. However, this is a session exclusively focusing on the Western mind and how the last roughly 200 years has shaped the Western mentality and how that informs its current state. So, to start setting the frame, we must first acknowledge how long Christianity had held a monopoly over the Western mind. The hegemony of Christianity and how it frames the world was all-consuming for the last roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years, depending on where. Something undermentioned about religion is how consuming its ontology is. And what I mean by that is the way you interpret the world, the way that you interpret nature, other people, life, what we're doing here, what we're on about, what we're moving towards, all of that comes in the package. And so this power structure is dissolving. And accordingly, we see two major attitudes coming out. One is an absolute angst. This is especially embodied in the arts. You see in Expressionism how the humdrum of the world is really taking over. This cynicism, this saturnine energy, dread. This is also intermixed with industrialization, how the cities are growing, there are too many people, and this dehumanizing effect that comes from said cities is felt and aptly shared by such thinkers. If you want a sense of this dread, then you can look to Schopenhauer or Nietzsche. Existentialism is really getting its footing by virtue of this one approach. The other attitude that comes along is hope, a great hope of what could be. People are asking questions that they never had the opportunity to ask before. So therein comes, of course, evolution. That's the big thing. And there, People are being told that we come from monkeys, and people don't know what we are or what we're doing since they've lost a frame overall, but to be told that it's monkeys, that we come from monkeys of all things, was satirized and absurd to that mind. And then in the midst of that as well, you have psychology coming forward. Freud asserting that things in fact aren't logical, that logic is based in the unconscious, and that is an untenable and unknown oceanic feeling. And amidst that, the spiritualism movement that wants to ask questions about the unembodied spirits or the nature of death. These fundamental religious questions that were never entertained or never had the space to be entertained. And so now comes this investigation, not to mention that science and spiritualism are wedded. They are mending in this time. And so the scientific brigade could hold significant promise in investigating spirits. And so you can get a light sense with even just the mentions of these different minds that are competing, of the interpretation of the world, that this is wild. People don't know where to root themselves. And so on one hand, you have that saturnine impulse of, this is absurd, they're telling us we're monkeys, that nothing makes sense anymore, that people are doing witchcraft to conjure disembodied demons. And then on the other end, we can unlock the mysteries of life, we can unlock the mysteries of the mind, and we can unlock the mysteries of spirituality and the paranormal and the parapsychological. It should be noted that this impulse of spiritualism is 100% rooted in animism and in shamanism. The practices of spiritualism are a kind of archaic revival of practices that had always been in the world and still are always in the world, yet it seems divorced from that because it's uniquely Western. It's trying to make that shamanic appeal or that spiritual contact appeal in the frame of the Western mind, as opposed to embracing the many other things that come along with folk traditions. So we should note right here that there is a kind of quiet renaissance of the animistic inspiring the new age of spirituality. So macroscopically speaking, you can see that the doors have kind of flown open. There is a very substantial wonderment coming from this enterprise, coming from this experimentation, from this gaining of framing. But with that wonderment comes uncertainty, and thus you can explain not only the seeking and the promise of the future, the hope of the future, but also the dread and the angst and the loss that comes from such changes. This previous concern about industrialization leading to dehumanization gets its full send as we approach the 1900s. This industrial revolution begins to fracture agricultural communities, fracture towns and families, rip them away from this anchor that is mutuality and community, and instead throw them into assembly lines that dehumanize, categorize, and make them number. This is a very impersonable and inhumane way of thinking. In a large respect, this is the beginning of what will become hyper-individuality, where community is no longer facilitated. Mutuality in others is no longer facilitated. The individual must strive to survive in this world and to flourish at the cost of anybody. This is egoic. So it's not to say that this Western history was not egoic, certainly not. But now it's being fed in a more substantial way than it ever has before. It's being permitted, perpetuated, and allowed to go further than it ever has before. Amidst this industrial dehumanization, World War I pops off. And uniquely, people don't know how this happened or why we're fighting. Historically, there always used to be a morale or an ethos behind why we're fighting this war, what we are all gathered to accomplish, what we are giving our lives to. This, though, makes it much more apparent that it is a meat grinder, a senselessness about all of this death. If you read the accounts and the journals during this time, that is the sentiment. Not to mention that this industrial age is now offering planes in the sky. That is absurd. These planes in the sky being used as weaponry, mustard gas filling the air, this invisible, odorless poison, plagues being thrown at each other from miscellaneous directions, tanks rolling through the fields. What are these contraptions of metal? There is a palpable alienation, dehumanization in the midst of this experience, unlike anything that has ever been experienced in the history of mankind. But the human spirit is still strong, and it still persists in that it wants to fight against what's becoming of the world. It wants to fight against this dehumanization. And the best way to illustrate this is through art. And I want to make a straightforward statement. Art is a direct expression of what we are experiencing in our day and age. If the governmental, if the political, and the historical are all numbers churning together, then art is the final distillation of all of those factors. Art is also human. The governmental, the societal, the social, these are abstract. The world is only experienced by people. And the people reacting to this experience make art. So in this way, art is the best, most sincere readout of what the human psyche is going through and what they are experiencing. Now, in this day and age, art seeks to satirize what is going on, this dehumanization, and thus comes Dada. Dadaism is absurd in the sense of what it's reacting to. All too often you see that it is using mechanistic imagery, abstract square forms, to illustrate what society thinks we are. We as number, we as machine, we as a computation. This is what its mission is. To point this out, to point out the absurdity of making the human being reduced in this kind of way. It is a snarl towards that direction. It claws out at that direction. And art is being mobilized as a political tool. In this way, art, Dadaism, is a mirror of what the world is projecting onto people. It's shining it right back at it. And so the art makes you uncomfortable often. It makes you question. It makes you feel defeated. This is the spirit of the times as it is transmitted through medium. There is a genuine concern for where we are going with this whole humanity thing. Should we turn around? Should we stop this? What can we do? Religion isn't going to save us from this. Technology is only creating more means of killing us. Maybe art can save us. And there, Dadaism gives way to surrealism. And surrealism has a mission. The mission is to expand the mind, to expand the imagination beyond the bounds that it has historically been held to, in seeking new ideas, in seeking a new way of being. This wants to break open the boundaries. And out of the gates, it is tied with spiritualism. In surrealism, you utilize, or you were utilizing, hypnagogic states. You were utilizing channeling techniques, automatic writing, in order to facilitate this change of imagination. So the integration of spiritualism into this is substantial. This is a will to experiment, to explore the psychic realms, to figure out what to do. And this earnest creativity just simply needs that exploration. It's never been here before. It's never done anything like this before. So what can be done needs to be discovered, and thus how strange it can appear to us often. But they are not the only ones pushing the boundaries here. The halls of secret societies have cracked open just a little bit more, and the likes of Theosophy and the movements around Aleister Crowley come about. And Crowley, of all people, will do everything he can to push against that continuous influence of Christianity's hegemony, to try to break that ontology mentioned, that frame of thinking about the world, and instead try to embrace something other. Theosophy will do its best to fill that open space by offering comparative religion, by introducing the West to Eastern mysticism and to long-lost traditions. And so yet again, we can see how the collective mind is reeling. What to think, what to believe, all of this new reintroduction of things that were pushed off, suppressed by our way of thinking about the world. The amount of information is coming in at a pace that the human mind just simply can't distill. And that's quite evocative of the modern age, don't you think? So here you can see all the competing interests. You have the continuity of Christianity asserting to hold on to as much as it can. You have Theosophy, spiritualism, the Crowley movement, various esoteric and arcane talking heads, and amidst this as well, industrialization, science also seeking and promising to fulfill some of this purpose that is being lost in the collective sense. And so it's no wonder that there's so much political upheaval and political questioning and valid experimentation happening throughout this whole time period that we're discussing. From the 1800s until this early 1900s bit, so much is being introduced in the way of what we should do and what the future should look like and who should rule it and how it should be ruled and so forth. And in a very reductionist sense, you can see that with the ensuing World War II. Empires, monarchies, national socialists, communists, capitalists, all of these things battling for room, rubbing shoulders with each other across the world and fighting it out with all of these new industrial means of destroying each other. The dehumanization aspect that has been brewing pops off in such a vile and abominable way across the board. But now there is a different kind of ethos. It's not like World War I. Now there is a political ethos overall, a defense of the homeland, or a future insurance of this political modality. The planes, the tanks, the chemical warfare, all refined to a greater degree. And the cruelty of what's becoming of the world, asserted in a unnegotiable, nightmarish fashion. A general synopsis of modern history would say that the 50s at large were peaceful, very proprietaristic, and upkept. But of course, looking a little deeper, you can see that that's clearly not true. But for our purposes, it's worthy to note that the surrealists have never stopped. And the surrealists are also continuously aligning themselves with political experimentation. And so art is still seeking to have this level of agency, of affecting the world and of affecting how we think and what we should do. On the American front, then there are the beats, and that is full of a kind of vitriol, a satire towards the state of the world. But what we know best is what comes about the 60s. And generally, it seems that the 60s is just a kind of fluke pop-off that just had no way of explaining its coming to being. There's just people that just started going wild all of a sudden. But amidst all that has been discussed so far, this resurgence of animism is continuing, and that comes in the form of magic mushrooms, that comes in the form of mescaline, and the invention or the discovery of LSD and ecstasy. These things had already been done, but by the time the 60s comes around, the embrace of this archaic revival comes to bear, full frontal in the culture. Art previously had an inclination towards these very rough, mechanistic forms, but we notice in the 60s there becomes a much more amorphous and circular and spiraling forms that come about the art. This is uniquely telling because the inspiration or the draw now for a solution to this isn't as much political as it is spiritual. And the dream that's being fostered collectively is a dream of union and of compassion, of putting down the means of war that have been collected, the terrors that have been created, and instead seeking to embrace a holistic cultural union. This dehumanization that has been allowed to grow out of proportion is being answered with its remedy: compassion, community, secular embrace, and art, music, dancing, all of these things re-embraced. This is our past. Psychedelics in this intermixture play a very commonsensical role in that the will to expand the mind, the will to break open the doors of perception and to see the world in a whole different framing than we've allowed ourselves is the earnest will. And psychedelics, etymologically speaking, simply means mind expanding, and that is the will. And it's no wonder that these things have manifested or reintroduced themselves from the folk religions that had been suppressed by the Western hegemony. I am not over idealizing the people of the 60s. I am idealizing the dream that was fostered because this is uniquely uniform. When innovations and this experimentation were being given in the earlier eras that we've been talking about, there wasn't this cohesion. Whereas in the 60s, it seems that it has been allowed to distill long enough to understand that mutual dream. We mutually agree that this is what we will. This is what we want from the future. And still yet we have this hope of the future. This is Tomorrowland of what will and can be, and we together can put in the honest labor to make this happen. And this involved having uncomfortable and authentic conversations with groups that were otherwise cut off from each other by virtue of the colonial age, by virtue of this collective dehumanization, this ontology of the West, and of course, classism. And instead, we're going to sit in it. We're going to acknowledge it. And so it's no wonder that race relations are acknowledged, sexual relations are acknowledged, indigenous culture is acknowledged. All of these things come up in this way because this is the dream, that dream of unity, compassion, humanizing humanity. But tragically and in earnest, this is the last call of this kind of liberation, of this dream, of this essence. From this point forward, it will be degraded. The egoic shadow will come to reign over all of this. The 70s still has a degree of innovation. Then the 80s is its death. And the 90s is stale, with some flights of its absurdity in punk. And then here we are, roughly speaking, super macroscopic, but here we are. But we are by no means done. There is so much left to distill. I want to better define what I've meant in saying egoic. This very specific approach to life of thinking of others as a money well or as a number that can further assure my not just financial stability, but my financial affluence, and the culture celebrating those that best exploit and make category of other. This is that essence, that egoic essence. Me, 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 me. The hyper-individuality, as it's continued throughout this era, is gotten to such a point that it has eaten away at all semblance of actual authentic community, to the point that people are no longer able or comfortable to have these authentic conversations as they were happening, say, during the 60s, to be able to sit in that uncomfortable trauma that has been gathered and to attempt to patiently and with grace work it out. Instead of going through the hard work of we, it is much easier to go with the fold and concentrate on I. The angst, the anxiety, the frenetic pace of modern life disallows from the space that's needed to facilitate this. We no longer dream of this overall spiritual inclination that was before. We don't innovate in that same way. We don't experiment with what could be. Instead, we are resigned to this kind of purgatory that continues indefinitely, and thus there is no hope for what the future brings because we don't facilitate the space to create that hope and all of the beauties that come along with it. If we notice the spiritualist, or if we notice the early brigade of science, or if we notice the surrealists or the Dadaists or the 60s movement, then we can see that there was this idea, this hope, and that came from mutual agency. It's not something that anyone can do alone. We assumed in these times, believed that the world should represent us, that the systems of rulership should represent us. And it seems that this divorce from the machine of the world and actual humanity has become a wide, cavernous separation. So one might ask, why are there no new spiritualities? Why are there no new political ideologies? Why are there no new religions? And I'll just use that as an instance. If you really just think about it, a religion, just as an example, is created because enough people got together to collaborate and discuss what they believe and what they could all get behind. And thus it is created. Or somebody came out the gates with such a substantial proposal that people were willing to go along with that and then throw their own add-ins on. This creativity comes from an assumption, again, or a belief that there is somewhere to go with it. But also, this creation comes from having the time to actually experience life and the world. I am not going to get up on the soapbox here and start preaching. I just want to point out this narrative of becoming to show and to see where we're at. And based off of this narrative, it seems that we've lost a few things that we should take note of, and that these are some potential remedies that have been left behind. If we are in a labyrinth and we are reaching a dead end, then we have to turn around and retrace our steps and acknowledge the path that we didn't take. And this is exactly what we've done before. The Renaissance did this to a T. Society and culture felt itself coming to the end of a cul-de-sac. And in order to go forward, we have to acknowledge what we left behind. And so the Renaissance started to dig up all the works from the ancients. And so much of what we have from history is because of their efforts to do so. And in this same way, we have to have a Renaissance. We have to look back. So what have we lost? We've lost this community, this actual human contact community. And while the church, for instance, has been shown to be an issue, the baby thrown out with the bathwater is community. That is what we are not replacing. We also don't dance anymore. And that might sound silly, but in the ancient of days, we had all the means to dance. And this is good for your mental health if you want to reduce it that much. But it was tied with the ceremonious, and it was tied with the special occasions, and even into the everyday affairs. You could do that without looking like a fool. And the fact that it's as alien to us as it is now tells us something. To be able to let go and to embrace whatever you want to call it, the Dionysian, or just simply to be vulnerable and to be authentic, or to move in the way that you feel proper. We've lost the dance, we've lost the jovial. But there is significant promise here. There is already much in the way of labor that has been done in this Renaissance to see a greater empowerment of indigenous communities across the world, to see neo-pagan communities seeking to re-embrace their ancestral folk spirituality, to see people diving into ancient grimoires or the arcane or the esoteric, or any of this is in a good interest. This is seeking the answers and the wisdoms from all traditions and from the past. Ultimately, it should serve humanity. And that is the antidote here, the humanities. I'm not proposing this wild undertaking of art or to go and support your local humanities programs, but it's just to say, if we are underfunding the humanities, it's because we don't prioritize humanity. That is not of interest to us, and that says a lot. And so anything that furthers this mutual compassion, anything that furthers a collective identity, means a lot in a world that is purely preoccupied with the egoic hyper-individualism. And anything that we can do to help facilitate in our own grassroots ways, whatever, a we, instead of profiting off of each other, to have communities to help bolster each other so that we can stand better together, not just in the way of finances, but also in the way of belief, in the way of quality of life, in the way of mental health, however you wish to rationalize it. But just like in the 20s or just like in the 60s, we have to be willing to be weird. It has to be allowed to get weird and to seek areas and opportunities that we never thought possible, to reimagine the world in ways that we never anticipated. It's only to point out that our thinking has become too narrow, and the beauties, the boons of these periods is because people wanted to push past that narrow way of thinking, past how we've been overly informed or indoctrinated to consider what the world is and how it goes and what we're on about. We need to expand that imagination, expand that frame of thinking. And so in this way, it's not that the world needs to change to save us. If we change the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we perceive collectively, we pay it forward in that way, then it changes. It manifests differently. Again, it might be idealism, but in this way, it is important, very important, that we foster our passions, that we keep wondering, that we stay inspired, and that we stay curious. The Spiritual Studies course is an effort towards free public education on matters of spirituality, comparative religion, and in this case, philosophy and history. This session is coming to you because I've been supported by others in the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. This makes a big difference in knowing that it's well received, and helping to improve it and to help it continue. This is a big subject, and I want you to pick it apart. I want you to talk about it. I want you to say where you disagree and where you agree, or help further its hypothesis. I think its mission is very apparent. But anyway, I'm done with the talk, so I should stop there. If you like this session, it's in thanks to those that supported it, and that is The Slow Leak, John Cresswell, Deborah Cano, The Seder Witch, Kristen, Nora, The Irrational Sage, Scorson, Craig Mitchell, and quote someone. We are not done in this subject, so pay attention to the ones to come.